Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is the 15th lecture in a 20-part lecture series that I'm posting on the history of ethics in the Western tradition primarily. And at this point in the series of lectures, we just finished a lecture on ethical relativism, but that was a bit of a tangent that I took because I had been talking about the subjectivist ethics of David Hume, the 18th century thinker David Hume. And so I want to get back into, in this lecture, the flow of ideas in the 18th century. And specifically, I want to talk to you today about the German-speaking philosopher Immanuel Kant, who's doing some really, really influential work in the Western philosophical tradition in the late 18th century. And, you know, Immanuel Kant, it's really sort of hard to overstate his impact on the tradition. In particular, the way he has a debate that very much builds off of and reacts to the work of David Hume. Apparently somebody, I forget the guy's name, translated the work of Hume from English to German, and Immanuel Kant got a hold of this work, and when he read it, supposedly he said something to the effect of, "I freely admit it was the work of David Hume that awoke me from my dogmatic slumbers." Wonderful phrase. You know, Kant's kind of a notoriously difficult person to read sometimes because of sort of the systematicity and thoroughness of his writing. But in that one poetic phrase there, he gives credit to Hume to really making Kant realize that he has some more things to think about with regard to morality, and also the two have quite a debate over the nature of truth itself in the philosophical field of epistemology. But our focus here will be on the work of Kant reacting to Hume in the field of ethics. Now, you may recall from my lecture on David Hume that Hume had a kind of a very sort of down-to-earth subjectivist account of ethics that said something to the effect that it is our human ability as social creatures to be sympathetic and empathetic with one another. Specifically, the term Hume uses is to employ our capacity for disinterested sentiments. And that ability in human beings gives rise to morality as a possibility and undergirds all of our moral judgments with one another. And then Hume argues that most moral disagreements really are actually related to misunderstandings about the situation, that if we were to use our reasoning capacities to sort of get straight on our interpretations of what has actually happened, what the situation is, what the facts are, and then we were to use our general human ability for sympathy or disinterested sentiments, more often than not, we would find that we would have moral agreement. Now, I think what Kant is reacting to here is that Kant believes, as many of us do, in a kind of a truth about moral right and wrong. And I think he sees and respects in Hume that Hume is right to an extent, that if we start from subjective sentiments, the best we will ever get to is something like the possibility of general moral disagreement. But Kant's intuition about morality is that there is a truth about morality. And I'll start to use this kind of stronger language, an absolute truth about morality. And while he respects the work of Hume, he calls it out as a kind of a scandalous situation that here, in what we now think of as the height of the Enlightenment period in Western civilization, philosophy's been running for, you know, over 2,000 years now, and it has so far failed to give a plausible and persuasive account of the truth of morality. And Kant thinks that that is scandalous and it is a problem. We should be able to do that, and so he makes it part of his life's work to boldly, right? Kant is nothing if not bold, to sort of dare a theory of absolute moral truth. Now, remember that Kant is working at the end of the 18th century, and he's a very well-educated and thoughtful guy, so he's not going to pretend that what we've called the modern crisis in ethics has not unfolded. So Kant is very much aware of the limitations of appealing to something like scripture or revelation or even a teleological based natural moral order in order to justify our moral claims. And so Kant's got a real challenge for himself, and that is to explain absolute moral truth while admitting that humans somehow construct it, right? Like, this is going to be the genius of the Kantian endeavor here. And he's got a couple of works that are relevant on this topic. I'm going to pull ideas primarily from his work that was published in about 1785. Translated into English, the title is something like The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. And I like to dwell on that title just for a second there, because I think it underlines the boldness of his endeavor here. The foundations, sometimes it's translated as the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Okay, let me paraphrase that to sort of lead you towards an interpretation of that. The basis for the metaphysics, for the reality of morality, right? The foundation for the reality of morality. And again, admitting that it's not going to be scripture and that it's not going to be some unobservable natural moral order or natural moral law. Kant's going to have to somehow, say how we are the foundation, and yet still try to convince us that there is a capability for us to discover, in some sense, / construct the truth about morality. And the way he's going to do this fundamentally is reject the Humean starting point. He's going to reject the Humean claim that morality is grounded in sentiments. Again, I think he respects Hume's thinking enough to realize that Hume was thorough in his considerations, that if we start from some form of subjectivism, the best we could get to through some kind of Humean account is general moral agreement if we get the facts straight. But Kant wants to be able to offer a persuasive account of absolute moral truth and a kind of a clarity about the truth of moral claims. And so he's going to reject the subjectivism of Hume. He's going to reject sentiment as a foundation for morality. And so the foundation for the metaphysics of morals, to sort of, spoiler alert, jump to the conclusion here, is going to be reason, rationality. One other way I like to talk about it is a kind of a reason-based objective perspective on life, that the foundation for the reality of morality for Kant and the Kantians that come after him is in the human capacity for objectivity. Okay, now I'm going to unpack that in the course of this lecture for you, but I want to start off, as Kant does in his work, The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, by posing sort of the initial question of the text, which is, what is goodness? In some ways, I recognize a little echo of Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics here in this sort of starting search for ideas of goodness, or what for Aristotle, it was what do people seem to be living for. For Kant, his version of that is, what do we imagine to be truly good? And I say truly good because Kant's phrase is something like good without any qualification. Is there anything in life that seems good without any qualification? And he explores the possibility that maybe what he calls the gifts of nature, perhaps some kind of inherent strength or intelligence, might be considered good without qualification. And he says, well, actually, if you think about that for any length of time, imagine that you give somebody with really bad intent, great strength and great intelligence, do you make them somehow good? Or do you actually magnify the badness in their intentions. And how can we say that something is good if it has this capability of magnifying the badness of someone's intentions? And so he rejects the idea that the goods of nature are good without qualification, because it sort of depends on how you use them. And then he considers the goods of fortune, the gifts of fortune, I think is the phrase, gifts of nature and gifts of fortune. And the gifts of fortune, maybe something like reputation or wealth. You know, I think even today we tend to think of, well, you know, I wouldn't turn my nose up at, you know, an extra $1 million in my life, right? But Kant says, look, is wealth or, you know, reputation somehow inherently good or good without qualification? He says, again, it really depends on how it's used. If you give somebody with bad intent wealth or reputation, then you just simply magnify their capacity for doing bad. And so how can this be good without qualification? It's more neutral. Again, what I think is happening here is that Kant is in some ways doing a little bit of, how shall I put this, a little bit of philosophical jujitsu. He's trying to get his readers a little off balance, I feel like. He wants you to, you know, he says, you know, is wealth good? Is intelligence good? And he wants to get us sort of leaning into that, yes, and then sort of say, actually, whoop, no, it's not what you think. And because he gets us off balance in this way, he's sort of opening up a space for us to consider thinking about morality in a completely new way, because Kant is a pretty radical and revolutionary thinker. In many respects, he's going to end up defending a fairly traditional and conservative notion of morality, but I want you to focus on how he does so, because that's what's so uniquely Kantian and what's so uniquely modern about his work in the 18th century, is how he's going to defend this fairly traditional or conservative notion of the kinds of things that are traditionally right and wrong. The reason why for a Kantian they're right or wrong is very unique to the Kantian approach. And I've already foreshadowed that it's going to be about rationality and about taking an objective perspective on existence. And here I was just sort of returning to the beginning of the work, the foundations of the metaphysics of morals, and I was developing for you this sort of almost rhetorical stance that he takes to start off, you know, what is good, and get you a little off balance. But the other thing that he's going to do, I think, in the beginning of this work, is he's going to set us up for a certain direction that he wants to take our thought. Not only does he get us off balance, that what he does next is he says, actually, just when you might be about willing to give up on the idea that anything is inherently good or anything is good without qualification, he says there is one thing that is good, at least without qualification, and that is a good will. Okay, now the notion of will is an important, I would say, 18th and 19th century concept, particularly in German philosophy. You know, let's think of it maybe simply as that which drives us, right? That which motivates us to act, whatever that sort of, that impulse within us. We are alive and we have this will to act. And in some sense, what Kant seems to be saying here is that when we will to act towards what we believe to be right, simply because we believe it to be right, that would be an act of goodwill. That would be being determined by that which Kant would call goodwill. And he says this capacity in human beings is good without qualification. Think about it. He says, no matter what happens, if you have an act of goodwill, there is something there that we will always admire, and it is just that. It is the goodwill behind the act. You know, if you were to, you know, I often use this example, if you were to see an elderly person that seems unstable in his movements coming down the stairs, and you were to stop everything you're doing and run off to help that person just to make sure that he gets down the stairs safely, even if you end up tripping and bringing the guy down the stairs, which would be terrible, we're still going to admire something about what you did. You know, it's not the consequences, and this is really important for Kant. It's not the consequences. This will be more important, especially when I develop these ideas in my next lecture on Kantian absolutism and the critique of Kantian absolutism. But keep in mind that it's not about the consequences for Kant. It is, what he's doing here is drawing our attention to two things. It's going to be the kind of actions we engage in, but equally important and maybe uniquely important in terms of conveying moral worth to an action is the motivation behind it. If you are helping that guy down the stairs simply because you think it is the right thing to do in that moment, maybe without any consideration for, the fact that you might be late to a class or a meeting or something like that, they forget any considerations that you're opening yourself up to a lawsuit in today's litigious society. You just do it because it's right. Even if the guy ends up in the hospital and you end up getting sued, there's still something we can admire, and that is, to use the Kantian phrase, your goodwill. And just to sort of make the point, let's take that example a step further. Let's twist this sort of, thought example, this thought experiment for a second. Imagine that you help this old guy down the stairs and your friend confronts you after you're done. You make it down the stairs all the way. This one turns out good, and the old guy's off and says, "Thank you very much." And you're like, "Well, you're very welcome, sir. It was my pleasure to be of service." And your friend comes up to you and goes, "What's up with that? Did you know that guy?" And you say, "Absolutely, man. Don't you recognize that guy? That's the guy that donated all the money to the library. That dude is rich." Okay, does that change it at all for you? Does that, and for a Kantian, absolutely that changes it for you. In this case, we even got the guys down the stairs all the way, so the outcome was better. But what changed? Well, what changed is because the way you talked about him being rich right after you helped him kind of sullied, right, the idea of your motivation. Like, why did you help the guy? Was it just because you thought it was the right thing to do? Or did you have this ulterior motive, we often say? Was this maybe wasn't an act of goodwill? And all of a sudden, the very action itself, while Kant would say it is the right action, the action is going to be sort of robbed of its moral worth because you were not, to use Kant's language, acting from duty. You were not acting from this motivation that this seemed to be your moral duty in the moment, that it just seemed to be the right thing to do in this moment to help that guy. Now the implication is that you help this guy out because somehow he's rich, and maybe somehow what were you expecting, a tip, or you just wanted to be, seen in a positive light by somebody with so much money, whatever it was. Your response after to the question of why did you help has kind of, muddied the water in terms of the moral worth of your action for Kant. And so he says there's one thing that's good without qualification. It is goodwill. And again, I think this start for the work gets us off balance, but it also begins to focus us on motivation in a way that we haven't discussed so far in the lecture series. There are great thinkers, Aquinas among them, who do deal thoroughly and systematically with questions of motivation, but it's particularly important and central to the Kantian approach. And so I want to sort of lead with that and put that forward right away. And frankly, that's just the way he starts his work. It's his own choice to sort of lead with the importance of goodwill. However, the next move that he makes is a little bit surprising if you think about it. He's just taken all this time to convince us that there's one good without qualification. And then he says, but yet, that is not the preeminent good. That is not, here's one way to interpret that, the greatest good with regard to the sort of universe seen through the moral lens. It's not the greatest good in reality with regard to morality. Which is a little bit weird, right? He's done all this work to convince us there's one good without qualification, and yet now he's going to go on to say that there is something more important, more central, more preeminent, or sort of greater than goodwill. And it is that which makes goodwill possible, which he calls the conception of law itself. Now, this English translation of a very small phrase in German is is a little bit odd, I think, particularly to our 21st century ears. A lot of times, especially as we explore, theories of life and philosophical theories, and frankly, any thoughts from a different age and time, we have to be very careful not to read too many of our own assumptions about the way somebody's using language. And this is particularly true of Kant. It was particularly true of Hobbes, I think, in his use of the idea of natural right and natural law. For Kant, he does a lot of work to make up a lot of his own vocabulary to deal with this. But in this case, the English translation of this short German phrase, which ends up in the conception of law itself, we've got to sort of get our own preconceptions out of the way in order to understand this. Here's how I think we should interpret this phrase, this idea that is somehow what makes goodwill possible. The only good without qualification is goodwill, but what makes goodwill possible, the preeminent or greatest good in the moral universe, is the conception of law itself. Conception in the sense of, yes, idea, but more importantly, maybe ability to give birth to, like in the sense of conceiving, the very ability to give rise to law, but not in the sense of legal code, more in the sense of principle. So if I rephrase to help you interpret this, this claim of what is the greatest good, the preeminent good in the moral universe, it would be something like the human ability to give rise to principles that we can use to govern our own actions, that give rise to, let's say, ideas, rules that we give to ourselves, that we consider almost like laws to ourselves, right? So self-generated principles, the ability to give rise to self-generated principles that we can take seriously. For example, let me use an example that I've made up to help draw attention to or sort of flesh out this point and help us understand it. Imagine that you are very well placed within the financial or accounting systems of a very large multinational corporation. And you are so well placed and so knowledgeable about the system, maybe more knowledgeable than anybody about the accounting practices of this corporation, that you see readily how you, because of your position alone, could make, let's say, just pick a nice round number, 10 grand a week disappear off the books that would be untraceable. And that because of the way you would do it, it wouldn't come out of anybody's particular pocket. Let's imagine, just to simplify this thought experiment, an example, that this is a corporation that's doing very well for its shareholders, and that 10,000 a week would be, just a drop in the ocean. And, but you as an individual, right, 10,000 a week, that's not a drop in the ocean, right? You have perhaps a strong, what Kant would call inclination towards 10,000 extra dollars a week. But in this moment, you would basically have to steal it. Now, this is a kind of a ring of Gyges moment. If I can hearken back to my lecture on Plato's Republic, this is a moment where you are free from consequences. And then maybe the question then is, do you take the money? Well, actually, I don't think that's the proper question here. Look, some people take the money, some people don't. Some people don't take the money because they don't trust their own analysis of the consequences, and they maybe are afraid of being caught. Now, notice that if you leave the money, if you don't steal, but you leave the money because you're afraid of getting caught, Kant would say you've done the right thing, but there's no moral worth to your action because your motivation is fear of getting caught. You're not doing this because it's your duty. And all I really need here to make my point and make the point for Kant is, is it possible that some people don't steal the money because they have given themselves a law, they have conceived of a law for themselves? That, they trust their analysis, they maybe think they're one of the smartest people in the room, and they certainly trust that they know more about the financial system than anybody else. That's not the point. The point is they just are living by a principle where they don't take what's not theirs. Now, again, I'm not asking you how likely is it. I'm not asking you how common is it. I'm just asking, is that possible? And I think it's not only possible, I think it's actual. And so we can maybe see Kant's point here. that there's something, and he's developing this, he's taking us, right, it's all sort of a clever rhetorical move, I think, to sort of point our attention to two things: motivation, which is important for Kant, and principles, which is going to be crucial to Kant. You want to have a principled approach to morality for the right reason, then you are maximizing your own capacity for, enacting morality or engaging in moral behaviors and, making correct moral judgments and doing actions in a way that makes you genuinely a morally good person. So, in some sense here, this is drawing attention to also a kind of a dichotomy of motivation that we need to flesh out or bring out here and get out on the table. Another point in which at which I think Kant is breaking with Hume very self-consciously. In this example, what I've suggested, right, is that we can be determined by, let's say self-interested motivation. We might take the money because we like the money. We might leave the money because we don't like the possibility of getting caught and judged and dealing with the consequences of being caught. Or we may leave the money because, as Kant would say, we have used our minds in a particular way to generate a kind of an objective approach on life. For example, let me give you a different kind of example here. Consider a referee in a basketball game. And imagine the basketball game is between green and blue, and say the referee loves, the green team and has always loved the green team. It comes from a family of people who loves the green team. And let's just add on here. Let's say that the referee admires the players on the green team and thinks that the players on the blue team are a bunch of cheaters and whiners and complainers and prima donnas. Okay, first question. Should this person ref the game? Well, clearly not, right? Why? Well, because we recognize the conflict of interest and the personal bias, the presence of certain, as Kant would call it, personal inclinations to be inclined towards certain actions that are not in the best interest. Because what do we ask of our referees? Like, what do we ask of our moderators, and what do we ask of our arbiters, and what do we ask of our judges and our jurors? Well, we ask for a kind of an objectivity, and we ask them to be determined by this objectivity. So let me ask you a slightly different question about about the referee. While admittedly it's not a good idea for this ref to ref the game between green and blue, different question. Is it at all theoretically possible that this ref could still call a pretty darn good fair game? And I think the answer is yes. It's not a good idea because of the conflict of interest. But on the other hand, this is what makes a good ref, right? Like, this is what makes a good judge. This is what makes a good juror. This is what makes this is what makes any of us objective, right? Is that we are capable of, and I'm going to try to make this as persuasive sounding as possible for development of the charitable interpretation of the Kantian position. We are, to greater and lesser degrees, capable of inhabiting a position where we use our capacity for thought to distance ourselves from our subjective or personal inclinations and inhabit a more objective perspective. And by gosh, while it's pert near impossible to call a perfect game because of human fallibility, maybe the mistakes that you might make as a judge would be you just saw it wrong. But on the same token, you could be, in theory, fair if you could inhabit this position. And again, I think Kant is beginning to sort of create some space between himself and Hume on this idea, particularly in relation to human motivation. You might recall, or you could find in my lecture on Hume, that it's pretty crucial for Hume when he says reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. That first part, reason is the slave of the passions, is a kind of a descriptive account of human motivation, Hume argues that always we are motivated by some version of likey or no likey, or by some version of sentiments or feelings. And Kant, I think, just wants to, disagree with Hume. He says, yes, much of the time we are motivated by our feelings, but it is also possible for us to be motivated by a kind of a perspective that is more purely, and I'm going to use that language, more purely. Kant uses the language purely. I'll soften it to make it sound a little bit more reasonable in this moment. More purely objective. Right? We can be motivated by a more purely objective perspective. Let me give you one more version of this. Imagine that you look in the fridge and you see the last little container of ice cream that your, let's say, roommate bought. And, there's a part of you, there's a personal inclination, if you're anything like me, that says, I like ice cream, and I am inclined personally to, to eat this ice cream, and so given that I have this feeling, I have some motivation to eat the ice cream. Okay. But come on, as a human being, as an objective being, as a being with reason, Kant would say you are capable of using your mind to get at least some perspective on your feelings in this moment, and say, somewhere in your mind, there's going to be this voice, right? Unless you are just like, near blackout drunk or something like that. When you see the ice cream, you might think, again, just, go with me. I think you'll see charitably. You can go with me. I'm not tricking you here. You might think, I want it, and I shouldn't eat it. Well, why not? Well, it's not mine. Now, look, you might eat the ice cream. That's not the point. Again, Kant doesn't need us to, agree that, nobody eats the ice cream. That would be foolish. That's unrealistic. A lot of people eat the ice cream, particularly under the influence of certain substances. But in this example, all we need to see the Kantian point is it likely, is it probable, is it even possible that you're going to have this sort of, and I'll use this, this sort of imagery of, the devil and the angel, on your shoulders. Get the ice cream and a spoon and hit the couch right now. You shouldn't touch it. You shouldn't eat it all. And frankly, you shouldn't touch it. Okay, now again, no matter what you end up doing, if you can agree that there's this perspective that says you shouldn't touch it, you got to ask yourselves, well, is that a feeling? Or is it, as Kant would like us to think, a kind of an objective perspective where we step outside or beyond our personal inclinations and see life from an objective perspective, see life from what we might call a fair perspective, right? Because we are beyond our personal bias and inclination for a moment, and we're saying, okay, I don't know how convincing this is to you, but I'm trying very hard to sort of develop this as a kind of a important foundation for thinking about ethics like a Kantian. And I hope I'm making it sound both charitable to Kant and plausible. And I hope I'm not, just engaging in any sophistry to do it. I'm trying to give you the best of what I think Kant is aiming at here. In some sense, you might counter with, well, what if you just leaving the ice cream because your roommate's going to see it's gone and there's going to be hell to pay? Well, okay, that's also realistic. That's possible. That would be a personal inclination. And as a motivation, you did the right thing by leaving the ice cream, but you didn't do a morally worthy action by leaving the ice cream in this moment, even though it's the right thing to do, because you did it from this personal inclination. You did it from this subjective feeling of fear of conflict with your roommate, or fear of retribution or something like that with your roommate. I want my food left in the fridge later on. Again, right thing to do, not a moral motivation, not coming from goodwill for Kant. You might further push the point and say, you know, maybe there's a feeling here that's sort of being smuggled in, and we're just using the language of objectivity to cover over. And the feeling is, well, if you want to be a good person, you should leave the ice cream. Okay, again, setting aside the cynical interpretation of that, if you want to be seen as a good person, then you leave the ice cream. Again, that's personal inclination, clearly, and that's an act that would lack moral worth. But if this is some genuine desire to be a good person, maybe we can be charitable enough to Kant to say that's a fairly unique, if we want to insist on calling that a sentiment or a feeling, let's excuse me, we had some technical problems with the system I'm using to record the lecture. We might see how Kant would be arguing that there is a unique perspective from which we can be motivated. And Kant, again, wants to call this reason, or I've used the language of rationality or objectivity to describe how we might be motivated in a very different way other than what Kant calls our personal inclinations. And I use this example of the ice cream, and let me stay with that just a second longer, because I want to introduce some new language here. Kant's going to go on to take this analysis of the possibility of being motivated to act in kind of radically different ways, what he would call personal inclination versus reason, and breaking from Hume's analysis on that. Again, you can see where this is going strategy-wise. He's going to break with Hume's subjectivism in order to develop a reason-based foundation for the reality of morality, in hopes that we can get all the way to a persuasive account of moral truth. Again, in the modern era, postmodern crisis, I would say that that's a bold move, but Kant is bold, and he's certainly an incredibly capable and systematic thinker. So, you know, try to be charitable and stay with me here as I develop this. But Kant begins to talk about these two ways of being motivated, by personal inclinations versus by reason, via what he calls two different kinds of imperatives, two different kinds of commands, what I often call two different kinds of should, or two different kinds of ought, which he calls the hypothetical imperatives and the categorical imperatives. And I think maybe if we stay with the ice cream example that I've been developing, that'll be helpful for a second. There is an imperative, a command, a should, that pops into your head if you're like me and you like your ice cream. You look in the fridge and you see this ice cream that you like. There's a should, there's an imperative, there's a kind of a force that you feel, and that is, I should eat it. And in this case, this would be a hypothetical imperative, because it has this form, Kant says, of if you like this kind of ice cream and you're hungry enough, then you should eat it. The should in this hypothetical imperative has a force if, and this is why it's called hypothetical, if you have the requisite personal inclinations present. Maybe something like you like this kind of ice cream and you're hungry for it in this moment. And if you have those two personal inclinations, then the should is going to have a force. Again, I'm not saying it's going to determine you what you do. You may or may not leave it. We'll get there. But at least you're going to feel like that pull, let's say, or that push to eat it, right? The should, or the ought, has a force, and the force is hypothetical, in the sense that it is dependent upon the presence of the requisite or relevant personal inclinations. If you like that kind of ice cream and if you're hungry for it right now, then you should eat it. But at the same time, in that example, right, there was another should. And that was, more particularly, a should not. You should not eat it. Now, if, remember, that should not comes from if you fear your roommate's retribution or anger, then you should not. Well, that's just another hypothetical imperative. However, there are shoulds or imperatives that have force categorically, meaning somewhat universally, as long as you are rational enough to be able to conceive of this objective perspective that we've been talking about thus far. So there's no if clause here. You know, that voice just pops into your head, you shouldn't eat it. You know, and you say, well, why not? Well, it just wouldn't be right, is kind of the answer you would typically give. You might say, well, it just wouldn't be fair, right? Now, again, if that bleeds over into, I don't want to be treated this way, then for Kant, that sullies the waters here a little bit. Now, let me go ahead and just go here because I've kind of stumbled my way onto this point. You will, I think, if you're on your game here listening to this lecture, recognize something in Kant's work here that is going to sound like a cliche or a saying or a rule, namely what we typically call in the West the golden rule, that is often thought to be really essential to a moral perspective on life. Okay, there's no accident that what Kant is trying to describe will remind us of that. Because in some sense that saying, and let's just, you know, pick out a particular version of it, something like, you know, treat other people the way you want to be treated. You know, there is something captured there that is at the heart of a moral perspective on life. And that's exactly what Kant is up to. But Kant isn't, you know, claiming that, you know, all you need in life is for your parents or your culture to give you this one little tidbit and then, you know, everything's fine. Kant's trying to do something a lot more subtle here. He's trying to explain what he thinks is at the heart of a moral perspective on life and how, if we're careful enough in our thinking about it, we can arrive at moral truths. And frankly, let me go ahead and pile on a little bit. The golden rule is a wonderful, you know, sort of saying to teach especially young people in order to sort of instill in them or maybe encourage in them what, you know, a Kantian would argue is kind of naturally already in there, and that is a moral perspective on life based on objectivity. However, let's go ahead and just point out that this is not to be understood in the way that is often worded, which, by the way, that shows up across cultural traditions in a kind of a powerful way, right? It's very, very common historically and culturally, which also, you know, kind of a convergence argument here leads us to believe that there's something, when the human mind conceives of morality, it often arrives at something like this. And Kant's going to just try to talk about this in a unique and modern way. And I just want to point out here that the typical ways that we pass this on to our young people to encourage their moral perspective has a kind of a downside that we don't often think about. And that is, when you say treat other people the way you want to be treated, unfortunately, that might be understood as you should project your subjective perspective out onto the world and imagine everybody else has it. Now, I know that's not a charitable interpretation of the golden rule, but I hope you can hear how that is unfortunately pretty much on the surface of the language. Treat other people the way you want to be treated, right? And so in some sense, the projection of our subjective perspective out onto others to imagine that they have the same perspective and same wants and desires in terms of how they want to be treated, that's not what we're getting at. And so Kant's not going to just sort of fall into this cliche, because in part, it's just not worded carefully, right? We're going to try to get at what is behind this important moral maxim that's so present within different cultural traditions. And this is Kant's modern 18th century attempt to show us that rationality and an objective perspective is what is behind something even like the golden rule. And, so back to this idea of two imperatives, the hypothetical and the categorical, there are some shoulds and should nots in life that have a force to act upon us. Whether or not they determine our action or not, we feel the force, like with our example, you shouldn't eat the ice cream. Whether you end up eating the ice cream or not, most of us can admit we feel something that I'm calling sort of the force of the power of that imperative or command in that moment. And Kant would claim that that is a categorical imperative. It is not reliant upon the presence of certain personal inclinations. Kant would want to say it commands us simply because we are rational enough to think our way beyond our subjective perspectives to a unique perspective of morality. And again, if we want to deny this and resist, in a way that might be just being a little bit difficult, here we're just going to try to understand the perspective. Once we understand it fully, we can come back to it and critique it, and we will. But, charitably here, if we want to say, if you want to be a good person, then you shouldn't eat the ice cream. Again, that's a fairly unique want, right? And so let's give Kant his point for now, that there's kind of two different ways to be motivated, and they're somehow significantly different. And let's stick with the language that I've given you here of the objectivity and rationality and sort of reason-based, cognitive, intellectual-based nature of this one perspective that commands us categorically, no matter what our interests are, our personal inclinations are, you shouldn't eat the ice cream. And so there's a set of these categorical imperatives that we need to discover / create, because remember, there's a kind of a subtle metaphysical point that Kant is making here. The foundation for the metaphysics of morals, the foundation for the reality of morality, is not out there in moral facts that are observable, whether through the commandments of a God, or in some natural law theory of morality kind of facts of reality and nature. In some sense, it is the birthplace of morality is the human rational perspective, right? And so in some sense, we all participate in the construction, recreation, and as we get into the subtleties here, you'll see why I'm tempted at times to use the term discovery, even though it's not a discovery of something sort of outside of ourselves, built into the fabric of reality or transferred into the natural world from the supernatural world. It is discovered through, for Kant, the utilization of pure logic. And there's no sort of choice, at least Kant thinks, about this, that if you follow the logic and you follow the argument, here are the conclusions. And this is going to be how he argues that humans construct absolute moral truth. And again, if you unpack that claim, construct absolute moral truth, that's sort of an interesting conceptual thing to wrap your mind around. But I think that's what Kant's up to. Okay, so I've introduced the language of the Kantian notions of hypothetical and categorical imperatives. He actually says, most of the time and much of what we do in life, we are determined by hypothetical imperatives, and that is not a problem. In many situations, there's just not a moral dilemma. But when we confront situations, and we should always try to be thoughtful about this, choices in our lives that seem to involve some kind of moral component or aspect, then we should try as best we can to bring what Kant would call pure reason, right? That logic, this objectivity to our considerations. And the next move in the argument, here's how I would characterize the next move that Kant makes, is to say, look, let Kant try to offer us some help in generating the objectivity that we should be bringing to morality. And he'll do this by saying that all of the categorical imperatives, all of these shoulds that command us simply because we're rational, ultimately can be sort of traced back to a handful, depending on how you want to count it, 3, 4, 5 different sort of ways of describing the essential objectivity that we should be bringing to our moral considerations. Here's a little echo of something we saw in Hobbes. I love to make these connections in my lectures for people so you can start to see, compare and contrast and see connections across different theoretical frameworks, trying to get them all in our minds in a useful way. You know, remember that when Hobbes described what he called the natural law, it really was just a kind of a natural conclusion that rational, self-interested creatures would arrive at when motivated by fear in the state of nature. And then he goes on to say there's a number of different ways that we could describe the natural law. I see an analog here in what Kant is saying. At the center of all the categorical imperatives, all the shoulds that are moral because they come from this purely rational or objective perspective, we could try to word this essential objectivity in a number of different ways that would make it useful to us, to help us, to aid us in bringing forth our natural capacity for objectivity, and in some sense, providing the platform from which we bring moral truth into existence. I think that's kind of a powerful way to think about what we're up to here as Kantians. And so, there are two very famous ones, again, multiple versions of this. One's called the respect for persons formulation, and it's stated simply as sort of, you should always treat persons, and here persons means rational beings, as ends and never as mere means. And this is useful in that it's kind of Kant is arguing, it's a kind of a way to see very quickly that it will always be wrong to merely use each other for our own ends. I may use my students to make a living. They may use me to get a greater understanding of certain areas of thought, but we're not merely using one another, right? Because we're still respecting each other as persons, as Kant would say, as autonomous self-governing agents, and we're respecting that about each other. So the use is not mere use. It is accompanied by a respect for each other as ends, meaning as autonomous agents sort of governing our own existences. But I want to set aside the respect for persons formulation for a second, and I want to direct your attention to what I think is the most famous version, most people would probably agree, the most famous version of what Kant calls sort of the essential categorical imperative, a sort of a supremely essential version at the heart of all the commands that command us simply because we are rational. They're all categorical. At the heart of them all, we might see what's called the universal law formulation, or the universal law version of the categorical imperative, sometimes called the universal law of nature formulation. And I'll kind of give you wordings that allude to both different titles there. So Kant says you should act only on those maxims, okay, maxims being sort of personal principles, personal rules of action. Act only on those maxims, personal rules of action, which you could at the same time will rationally will that they become universal laws, or maybe universal laws of nature. Okay, excuse me. So act only on those maxims, personal rules of action, which you could logically, objectively, rationally will that they also at the same time become universal laws governing everybody's behavior. Now, let's be clear here so we don't go down any sort of unnecessary dead ends. this is not about, you know, some supposed superpower where you could make everybody do the right thing. That's not what this is about at all. In some sense, this is about generating a kind of a thought experiment that will aid us to become more objective about our moral dilemmas, right? If Kant is right that an objective perspective is at the heart of a moral perspective, then what we want to do is try to bring increasing amounts of objectivity toward this ideal that Kant lays out as pure reason, pure objectivity. We want to be moving towards this ideal, and so we want to utilize a thought experiment that emerges out of this, and I think this is why this is the most famous version of the categorical imperative, thought of as sort of the supreme principle of morality. The universal law version says, again, just using some repetition to help us get it in our minds so we can go on and think about it, you know, act only on those maxims which you could rationally will at the same time that they become universal laws. Okay, again, why this is so popular and important as a version of the categorical imperative to understand is that it in some sense generates this thought experiment. One way to talk about that is that it generates a kind of a three-step process for thinking through our moral dilemmas that will allow us, Kant would say, to bring greater objectivity to our moral dilemmas. And ultimately, if we do this in a kind of a really efficient way, or maybe a pure way, if we could be purely logical about this thought process, we can discover / construct, recreate, you know, because we're not the first to this game, an understanding of the moral truth. That's where this is going, right? So the thought process, the three steps are something like this. You know, first thing you got to do is when you have a moral dilemma, you need to sort of ask yourself, what are you about to engage in? And so that is the sort of identification of your maxim. What would be the rule that would be governing your action if you were to do action A versus action B? You know, let me start to build a kind of an example, not Kant's, my own, that's kind of overly simple, but helps to, I think, get a grip on this abstraction here. You know, identify your maxim. Say you're in a situation where you're, you know, you see somebody drop some money, and maybe you need some money, and this person rather carelessly dropped it. So, you know, maybe, again, I think bear with me, you know, we all understand, right, that the right moral thing to do here is give the money back. But the key thing to be thinking about here in this context, as we do what's called meta ethics, and we think through, you know, how do we know, right? Like, what is the place of origin for the justification for the rightness of this action? You know, well, here's Kant trying to say that it's rationality, it's objectivity, and here's how you go about it. First of all, identify your maxim. And in this case, if you were to consider keeping the money, you would have some maxim like, I'll keep what I find even when I know who it belongs to. Now, second step in the process would be to treat your maxim as a universal law, right? To use a verb that Kant scholars have made up that's useful in this context, universalize your maxim, right? Imagine that everyone would act on this this rule, this personal principle, this maxim. And then third step, look for contradictions. Okay, if you haven't done a lot of logic, then you're at a small disadvantage here, but maybe you can use an intuitive understanding of this term contradiction. You know, look for something that just does not make sense about this world that we are imagining, right? We've identified our maxim, we have universalized our maxim, that's the first two steps, and now we are looking at this world with our capacity for logic and asking ourselves if there's something about this world that just does not compute, right? Like it just doesn't fit together. In formal logic, you know, a contradiction is something like P and not P, right? It's something like, I am here right now and I am not here right now. And if that's a paradox, if it's only a paradox, then maybe we can understand what I mean by right here physically versus right here emotionally or mentally, and see how this can fit together. But if I mean I'm physically right here, right now, and I'm physically not here right now, that's when you are going to look at me and say, I'm not sure I'm going to listen to the rest of this lecture, because if you contradict yourself like that, you're not making sense. Okay, now, if you will into existence, in some sense, through the thought experiment, a world that does not make sense, then you're going to be able to see what is not objective, not rational, not logical, and hence not moral. And so let's think it through with this little example that I've constructed so far. You're going to keep something that you found, quote unquote found, but you know who it belongs to. And in some sense, you identify your maxim. I'll keep, what I find, even though I know who it belongs to. And then you universalize it. Imagine everybody does it. Now you look for something that doesn't make sense about the world. Okay, there's some subtleties here about what Kant calls perfect and imperfect duties, but I'm not going to go there because I just want to give you I want to get you off the ground floor here and understand how Kant's trying to use objectivity as a foundation for the reality of morality. And in this case, I think what we would generate is probably an imperfect duty. But again, I'm going to set that aside. It almost depends on how I characterize the contradiction here. I'll try to characterize it a couple different ways. So universalize your maxim. Imagine a world in which everybody keeps what they find, even when they know who it belongs to, and ask yourself if something that doesn't make sense about that. Well, right on the surface, something that shouldn't make sense about that is, you want your stuff back. It's if you've never lost anything, which isn't true. You might lose something, and if you lose something, you want it back. Now, the contradiction here, again, is not a perfect one in that it's involving a certain personal inclination. It's based on something that you want in the world. But let me go ahead and try to flesh this out in a slightly different way that maybe gets us to see the contradiction in a slightly different way. Look, everybody loses things, and when they lose things, or everybody potentially loses things, right? When they lose things, okay, this is not some, very subjective desire here. When you lose things, you want them back because that's the nature of losing. Losing is not the same as giving away. It's not the same thing as throwing away. To use the language of losing is to use the language that implies necessarily that you did not intend to let go of this thing. Now, if, in some sense, if you will a world where everybody keeps what they find, even when you lose things, you're willing a world in which nobody gives back anything, even though everybody wants things back when they lose it. And, in some sense, I've tried hard to make this sound more like a perfect contradiction. However you, feel about my effort there, this is a good example just to get off the ground here. You identify your maxim and you universalize it and you look for a contradiction, and there is something there, however we characterize it, that doesn't make sense. It is not rational for you to will that everybody keep the things they find when they know who they belong to. Now, so importantly, final step here, right? Like those are the 3 steps, but you're supposed to draw your conclusion based upon this thought process that takes you through these 3 steps. And we've now brought a kind of a logic, right, to bear, right? Like this is Kant turning moral dilemmas into a logic problem. That's what I think he's up to here, into some sense, right, to bring pure objectivity, which we find in logic and mathematics very easily, to the more difficult realm of moral dilemmas. And if we do, Kant claims, we can discover the moral truth. And in this case, what we discover / construct is the moral duty to give back what you find when you know who it belongs to. Now, earlier in the lecture, I made the claim that Kant ends up, defending a fairly conservative or traditional notion of morality. What I meant by that is, we didn't need Kant to tell us we should give back the things, that it would be moral to give back the things that we find when we know who they belong to. However, the devil's in the details here, and the details I want to focus you in on here is how do you justify that claim? Because there are other principles like finders, keepers, losers, weepers that we might want to try to employ depending on how we were raised. Is this all just a matter of how you were raised? And if so, is morality just grounded in how you were raised? Is it just grounded in cultural traditions? Is it just grounded in your family's traditions? And remember, while those are descriptively accurate, they're not prescriptively helpful, because if we say that not only is morality grounded in culture and grounded in family practices and traditions, it's only ever grounded in those, we're collapsing into relativism, which is what the modern moral ethical theorists and philosophers are trying to avoid, because I think they see how unhelpful relativism is, and in some sense they're trying to salvage something that I think we need, which is moral discourse in society, an ongoing constructive moral discourse in society. And so they're trying to construct these frameworks that are persuasive and reasonable, and that within which, if we, as I in my earlier lecture said, climb these ladders, in this case in the Kantian framework, climb the ladder of objectivity, that we can participate more meaningfully and constructively in moral discourse. So let me use another example here to help you internalize the value, the potential value of the categorical imperative in the universal law formulation and the 3 steps that are associated with that. Let me use the most famous of Kant's own examples. Kant talks in his Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals about 4 very famous examples, but one's the most famous, and it's a little tangentially related to my example, which I talked about finding some money. Let's talk about borrowing some money. And let's talk about borrowing some money in a situation where you can't pay it back. Now, Kant doesn't clear up for us the motivation. Maybe you owe, some money to the mob and you're going to get your kneecaps broken. That'd be strong motivation. Maybe, somebody in your family needs medical care and you don't have the money, and you want to borrow the money from somebody who has more than enough to get this medical care. Okay. Unfortunately, Kant doesn't clear that up, but let's just, I think for the sake of discussion, it might be more interesting to sort of flesh it out and say, okay, maybe you need the money for the medical care for somebody, from somebody that you don't, that has more than enough. How would a Kantian look at this? Okay, well, remember, you should act only on those maxims which you can rationally will to be universal law. And so you need to identify your maxim. Okay, well, you're basically going to make a promise that you don't intend to keep. In promising to repay the money, because you won't get the loan if you don't, you're making a promise that you don't intend to keep. This sort of false promising. It's kind of a subset of lying, and Kant is notoriously, I would say, harsh on lying as immoral. In this case, false promising or making a promise you don't intend to keep. Your maxim is be something like this: I'll make a promise whenever I deem it necessary that I don't intend to keep. Let me leave it there, nice and simple. I'll make a promise that I don't intend to keep. Okay, universalize your maxim. Imagine in this thought experiment designed to elicit our objectivity that that everyone in the world is determined by this personal principle of action, this maxim, which is that they will make promises that they don't intend to keep whenever it serves their interests. And now, third step, look for contradictions. And this is why this is, I think, is the most famous example, because the contradiction here is a pretty neat one, pretty logical one, pretty, in some ways, perfect one. What does a promise require in order for it to work as a promise? Well, one answer is trust. Now, what won't there be in a world where everybody makes false promises at times? Trust. So here's your contradiction. You are willing a world in which there won't be any trust, And yet there will be these false promises, but promises require trust. So this world that you're imagining can't even exist in some sense, right? Because a world of false promisers is a world in which promising no longer exists because trust no longer exists. So a world of false promisers is self-contradictory. And so again, what do you conclude from this thought experiment? That you should endeavor to only make promises that you can keep. You have a moral duty to make promises that you can keep, and that you will keep. And again, fairly conservative, normative, ethical, moral claim here. You should keep your word. But I want to underline something here. What Kant thinks he's up to, particularly in this case, is the discovery / construction through this human capacity for objectivity, logic, and rationality of an absolute moral duty. And so I talked about, a couple of possibilities in that scenario. Do you owe money to the mob, or do you need money for for medical care? And are you asking somebody who has more than they could ever spend? And, for a Kantian, I think what's important, for Kant, let me put it that way, because there are people who have tried to update Kant's moral theory in various ways. But for Kant, remember that his project is about defending absolute moral truth, that he respects Hume enough to realize that if you start from subjectivism and you add empathy and you add reason's ability to get the facts straight, the best you get to is general moral agreement, maybe. And Kant believes that philosophy should be able to, after 20-something hundred years, explain the moral truth of reality, right? I mean, if you, kidnap kids and give them drugs in order to make them soldiers in your militia that is solely about stealing mineral wealth within the Democratic Republic of Congo, you're engaged in bad actions, and in some sense we want to say, if we can't explain why that is it's true, that is immoral, then we are failing, right, in our ability to give a good account of morality. And this is the scandal, that Kant is trying to correct. And what I've laid out for you is what I would think is kind of a genius, and I hope you can see it. I hope you can wrap your mind around it. Here's a kind of a way to see, to ask yourself the question, is Kant onto something here? Is everything that is immoral, if you run it through this thought process, will it in fact generate contradictions through the thought experiment? Can we see how it is illogical or irrational to will a world in which all people do this? And again, don't be confused. We know we can't make the world perfect in this way, but can we use pure reason to discover our perfect duties and our absolute moral duties to one another? Is it possible that Kant, through years of systematic thought and labor, where he lived this rigorously disciplined life and wrote these incredibly well thought out texts, has actually finally discovered for us, the true justification for the wrongness of promise breaking, for the wrongness of dishonesty, for the wrongness of suicide, to pick out another of his examples, for the wrongness of partying your talents away, as I somewhat playfully describe one of his other famous examples, of wasting your natural abilities to be a productive person in society, to word it another way, of the wrongness of refusing to be at all charitable when you have more than enough. Is it possible that Kant has given us, and again, listen to the cleverness, a purely modern, postmodern crisis account of how we discover what our moral duties are? Well, I'm going to leave that for you to decide, and I am going to cut my lecture off right here. Sorry about the technical difficulties here where the platform that I'm using for recording lectures and then publishing them just simply collapsed on me at some moment. So this lecture will be the only one so far in the series in 2 parts. But I hope that you will spend a little time wrestling with this, and maybe in a Kantian spirit, I hope you will find that objective perspective and leave that ice cream in the freezer, leave it where it is. Hope you're having a good day. Bye-bye.